All right, interpreting the Constitution. So, first off, I don't want you to think that when you hear the term interpreting the Constitution, that our Supreme Court judges are somehow like making things up, or they're like trying to read something into the Constitution that isn't there. That's not the case. But the issue is that the Constitution, by its nature, is very vague, right? So, that then requires judges to try to figure out, okay, what exactly does that phrase mean? And the two ways of doing it, all right, let's start with loose interpretation. That means that the judges are looking at it from a modern perspective, right? They think, okay, we should read the Constitution and we should try to figure out what does that mean to someone in the modern day, right? How would somebody in 2020 interpret that phrasing? A strict interpretation, the judge would say, okay, I want to try to interpret it and view it as best I can from the perspective of someone that was alive when the Constitution was written. Maybe even, in fact, one of the writers of the Constitution, right? What did they really mean when they say this? Okay. Now, why would both sides do this? Well, a loose interpretation would say, well, times change, right? I mean, come on. Like, some of our morals have changed, our values have changed, our culture has changed, and we can't expect, obviously, that the Constitution written 200 and some years ago, you know, could be viewed the same way. That doesn't make any sense. And the strict interpretation, people are saying, well, like, it needs to stay the same, right? Because it's a document that runs our government. We don't want our government to just change, right? We want it to stay the same. It's worked. It's enduring. And so we need to interpret the document that does that in the way that it was originally meant. Now, there's no one side that like is right or wrong, okay? Um, they have positives and negatives to each, but there's not one that's just automatically right. So let's look at loose interpretation for a minute here. So the biggest positive of loose interpretation is that it allows our country to deal with injustices very quickly, right? I mean, think about it. We don't have to worry about electing people that are going to respond to these injustices and then having them pass laws and have the president sign them into effect. And that takes years, sometimes generations, okay, in terms of, say, trying to end slavery or trying to bring about civil rights for African Americans. Those movements, those injustices took generations to happen. And so that can be slow and agonizing. And so a loose interpretation, though, would allow a Supreme Court justice to have a case brought before them, or a trial brought before them, and then they rule in a way that gets rid of the injustice. So think, like in my handout that I gave you, think segregating schools in America, right? That used to be okay. And we didn't have to wait for laws to change so much. The judges heard a case about it and said, Constitution doesn't allow that, right? There's the modern interpretation of the Constitution would not allow blacks and whites to go to schools that are separate and not equal in nature, right? So that can't happen, right? We are not going to allow segregation anymore. And so in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education wiped that injustice off the map. So that's the positive. The negative is that as there's new judges that come onto the court, what if they have different views than the judges that were on the court previously, right? Well, if you believe that the Constitution can be interpreted loosely, then you have to believe that those judges can then flip the opinion of the previous judges. So, easy example, right? Segregation was actually heard in a court case in 1896. Okay, 1896. It was called Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court actually ruled that yes, segregation is not only okay, but it would be good for our society. And then, not even 60 years later, right, about a generation or two generations later, there were new judges on the court. And in the case I just referenced, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, boom, they got rid of segregation. Okay, and so loose interpretation has a negative in that it can allow for some flip-flopping of opinions there. And also, there's never any justices that are elected. And so it seems a little, in some ways, unfair for 9 people who aren't elected by the American people to actually make really, really, really important decisions. Now, strict interpretation. Okay. So the positive of strict interpretation is that things tend to be very permanent, right? And things tend to be slow moving. So that when we recognize an injustice, we get rid of it for all time, right? We deal with it in a very complete manner, and we make sure that things are done thoroughly, because it's not just 9 judges that are making the ruling. It's going to take elections. It's going to take politicians to feel the pressure from the people in America, and then they're going to pass laws and even maybe write amendments to the Constitution itself to bring about change in our country. So again, great examples are things like prohibition, right? Getting rid of alcohol. Believe it or not, that was actually super popular in America in the 19 teens and 1920s. There was overwhelming support from the American population to prohibit alcohol. But it took a long time, right? They actually had to add it to the Constitution. It was an amendment. So it was a very serious deal. Things such as the injustice of not allowing women to vote, that took an amendment, right? The 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It's such a serious injustice that we added it to the Constitution rather than allowing judges to say, well, we need to allow women to vote. Now, the negative of a strict interpretation is they can take a long time, right? Women were agitating for the right to vote, rightly so, for a couple generations, right? Probably really since the 1850s, maybe 1840s, there was a push for women to vote. And it wasn't until 1920 that it actually happened. Okay, and so that's the negative. It can be very slow moving, and you can say, well, that's not right. Right, we need to solve these problems faster. So those are the 2 ways that judges tend to interpret the Constitution. And this is going to be important because tomorrow we're going to look at the court case of Obergefell versus Hodges and how it plays into the global issue that we're currently studying.